Pick up any product in almost any store anywhere on Earth, and there's a strong chance the transaction that brought it there was conducted in US dollars, even if that store is in Tokyo or Berlin or Sao Paulo. And the company that made the product is Chinese, and the raw materials came from Africa. And here's what makes this absolutely insane, because the United States represents only about 4% of the world's population and roughly 24% of global GDP. But the dollar is used in nearly 90% of all international currency transactions and accounts for nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves, and almost all oil trades happen in dollars, and most international debt is denominated in dollars, and major commodities, from gold to coffee, are priced in dollars. And we're talking about a level of currency dominance that has never existed in human history, because even the British pound at the height of the empire never controlled this much of global finance. And here's the part that seems impossible, because the dollar isn't backed by gold anymore since 1971, and the US government prints trillions of new dollars and runs massive deficits, and yet the dollar keeps getting stronger relative to other currencies. And during global crises, when you'd expect people to flee the dollar, they actually rush into it. And this happens even when the crisis originates in the United States, like the 2008 financial meltdown. And the question that economists debate is how a piece of paper with no intrinsic value maintains this stranglehold on global commerce. And the answer involves 5 specific mechanisms that work together to make dollar dominance essentially unbreakable. And when you understand these 5 reasons, you'll see why every attempt to replace the dollar, from the euro to the yuan to cryptocurrency, has failed and will continue to fail. And the first reason is something that was engineered 70 years ago and still controls global finance today. And that's the petrodollar system, which forces every country that wants to buy oil to first acquire US dollars. And here's how this creates an artificial permanent demand for dollars. Because oil is the most traded commodity on Earth, with roughly 100 million barrels consumed daily, and almost all of this oil is priced and sold in dollars regardless of where it's produced or who's buying it. And this means that Japan buying oil from Saudi Arabia has to conduct that transaction in dollars, and China buying from Russia historically had to use dollars, and Europe buying from Norway uses dollars. And think about what this means systematically, because every country on Earth needs oil to run their economy, and to get oil, they need dollars. And to get dollars, they have to either export goods to America or exchange their local currency for dollars on foreign exchange markets. And this creates constant demand for dollars that has nothing to do with the American economy and everything to do with the structure of global energy markets. And the origins of this system go back to 1974. When the United States made an agreement with Saudi Arabia after the oil crisis, and the deal was that Saudi Arabia would sell oil only in dollars and would invest their oil revenues in US Treasury bonds, and in exchange America would provide military protection and weapons and diplomatic support, and the Saudis agreed. And because Saudi Arabia was the largest oil exporter, this effectively set the standard for global oil trade, and other oil producers followed because the infrastructure for dollar transactions already existed and buyers already held dollars. And the feedback loop became self-reinforcing. And here's why this matters so much. Because it means countries need to maintain dollar reserves just to keep their economies functioning. And these reserves are typically held in US Treasury bonds, which means foreign governments are essentially lending money to the United States at low interest rates. And the scale of this is staggering, because foreign governments and institutions hold over $7 trillion in US Treasury securities, and they hold these not primarily as investments, but as necessary reserves to conduct international trade. And this creates what economists call an exorbitant privilege, where America can borrow money at lower rates than economic fundamentals would suggest, because there's artificial demand for dollar-denominated debt. And the practical impact is enormous, because it means the US government can run large deficits year after year and finance those deficits by selling bonds to foreign countries who need dollars. And this allows America to spend more than it collects in taxes and to maintain a higher standard of living than would otherwise be possible. And when people talk about replacing the dollar, they miss this critical point, because you can't just switch to another currency for oil transactions, because decades of infrastructure and contracts and financial instruments are all built around dollar pricing and unwinding that would require coordinated action by dozens of countries and oil companies and banks. And the incentive for any individual actor to defect from that coordination is enormous. And the second reason is what makes the dollar essentially indestructible, and it's the depth and liquidity of U.S. financial markets, which are larger than all other markets combined and provide a place to park money that no other currency can match. And here's what this actually means. Because the U.S. bond market is worth over $45 trillion and the U.S. stock market is worth over $50 trillion, and these markets are incredibly liquid, meaning you can buy or sell massive amounts without significantly moving prices. And compare this to other currencies, because the entire European bond market is smaller and less liquid, and the Japanese bond market is even smaller. And Chinese financial markets are heavily controlled by the government and not fully accessible to foreigners. And this size and liquidity matter enormously, because if you're a central bank or sovereign wealth fund or pension fund or insurance company managing billions or trillions of dollars, you need markets where you can actually deploy that capital and earn returns. And if you're holding the reserves of a major country, you can't just put them in any currency, because you need to be able to convert them quickly if there's a crisis. And U.S. markets are the only ones deep enough and liquid enough to absorb the kind of money we're talking about. And think about the practical implications. Because if Saudi Arabia earns $500 billion from oil sales over a year, they need to invest that money somewhere. And they can't invest it all in Saudi Arabia because that would cause massive inflation. And they can't invest it in most other countries because the markets aren't big enough. And U.S. Treasury bonds are specifically designed to absorb this kind of flow, and this creates a self-reinforcing cycle, because the more money flows into U.S. markets, the more liquid they become, and the more attractive they are for future flows. And here's the mechanism that makes this a permanent advantage, because building financial markets of this scale takes decades and requires legal infrastructure and regulatory frameworks and institutional trust. And even if another country wanted to create equivalent markets, they would need to maintain stability and openness for 30 or 40 years while capital gradually shifted and the political will to do. That doesn't exist because financial openness means giving up control, and most governments aren't willing to do that. And China has discovered this because they want the yuan to be a reserve currency, but they also want to control capital flows. And you can't have both, because reserve currency status requires that people trust they can get their money out, and capital controls directly contradict that. And the European Union has the euro, which looked like it might challenge the dollar. But European bond markets are fragmented across different countries, and there's no single European treasury bond that compares to U.S. treasuries. And the sovereign debt crisis showed that European bonds carry different risks depending on which country issues them. And this fragmentation means the euro can't provide the same safe haven function that the dollar provides. And during the 2008 financial crisis, global investors fled to U.S. Treasury bonds, even though the crisis started in America. And this revealed something profound about dollar dominance. Because when the world's financial system is in chaos, the safest asset is still U.S. government debt. And the third reason is something people completely overlook, and it's the network effects of dollar usage, where the more people use dollars, the more valuable dollars become. And this creates a lock-in effect that's almost impossible to break. And here's how network effects work in currency markets. Because if you're a business engaged in international trade, you want to use the currency that your suppliers and customers already use. And since most international contracts are denominated in dollars, it makes sense to hold dollar reserves and conduct your accounting in dollars and maintain dollar bank accounts. And this means even companies that have no direct connection to the United States end up using dollars because their trading partners use dollars. And think about a concrete example, because a Vietnamese company exporting furniture to Brazil could theoretically conduct that transaction in Vietnamese dong or Brazilian reals, but neither company wants to hold the other's currency, and converting between dong and reals would require going through multiple exchanges and paying conversion fees. So instead, both companies use dollars as the common medium, and this happens billions of times per day across every industry. And the cumulative effect is that dollar usage becomes self-perpetuating, because switching away from dollars would require coordinating across millions of businesses and banks, and the switching costs are enormous. And here's why this creates a permanent moat. Because once a network effect is established, the dominant player can be somewhat worse than alternatives and still maintain dominance, because the cost of switching exceeds the benefit. And we see this with technology platforms, where Facebook isn't necessarily the best social network, but it has all the users, so new networks can't gain traction. And the same dynamic applies to currencies, where the dollar might not be the optimal currency in theory, but it has all the users and all the infrastructure and all the contracts, and moving away from it would require everyone to switch simultaneously, and the coordination problem is essentially unsolvable. And countries have tried to create alternative systems because Russia and China have discussed conducting bilateral trade in rubles and yuan, and the European Union has tried to promote euro usage, and Middle Eastern countries have talked about pricing oil in other currencies, but none of these efforts have gained significant traction because the network effects are too strong. And even when two countries agree to trade in their own currencies, they often still use dollars as the reference price and settle in dollars anyway, because that's where the liquidity is. And here's the mathematical reality. Because switching costs increase exponentially with the size of the network, and the dollar network includes almost every country and bank and major corporation on Earth, and the switching cost is so high that it would require a catastrophic failure of the dollar to trigger mass exodus. And even then, there's no obvious alternative that could absorb the volume. And the fourth reason is what actually destroyed the Soviet Union's ability to create an alternative. And it's the role of the dollar in international debt markets, where most sovereign debt and corporate debt is denominated in dollars, even for entities that have no connection to America. And here's why this creates devastating lock-in. Because when a country borrows money internationally, they usually issue dollar-denominated bonds because that's what investors want to buy. And this means countries like Argentina or Turkey or Indonesia owe billions of dollars to foreign creditors, and they have to earn or acquire dollars to repay those debts. And this creates permanent dollar demand that goes beyond trade, because even if a country trades primarily with China and Europe, they still need dollars to service their debt. And the scale of this is enormous because there's over $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt owed by non-US borrowers, and this debt has to be serviced regularly with interest payments and principal repayments. And all of those payments require dollars. And think about what happens when a country's currency weakens. Because if Turkey borrowed in dollars and the Turkish lira falls in value, then Turkey needs to earn more lira to buy the same amount of dollars to repay debt. And this can create a debt spiral where currency weakness makes debt more expensive, which weakens the economy, which weakens the currency further. And we've seen this pattern repeatedly in emerging markets, from the Asian financial crisis in 1997 to the Argentine default in 2001 to the Turkish currency crisis in 2018. And here's the mechanism that makes this so powerful, because dollar-denominated debt creates what economists call original sin, where countries are trapped in a currency they don't control. And when global dollar liquidity tightens because the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, or because there's a financial crisis emerging, markets face simultaneous pressure because dollars become more expensive and harder to acquire. And this gives the United States enormous indirect influence, because Federal Reserve policy decisions affect the entire world through the dollar debt channel. And compare this to other currencies, because very little international debt is denominated in yuan or rubles, because investors don't trust those currencies, and even euro-denominated debt is much smaller than dollar debt, because the euro is younger, and the European Central Bank hasn't established the same credibility as the Federal Reserve. And here's why this creates a permanent advantage, because once you're in debt in a particular currency, you're locked in for the life of that debt, which might be 10 or 20 or 30 years. And even if you want to switch to a different currency for future borrowing, you still have to service existing dollar debts, and the refinancing of this debt keeps the cycle going. Because when bonds mature, they're typically replaced with new dollar-denominated bonds, because that's what the market demands. And breaking this cycle would require countries to run sustained current account surpluses to pay down dollar debt and build up reserves in other currencies, and very few countries have the discipline or the economic capacity to do that. And the fifth and final reason is what makes dollar dominance truly unbreakable, and it's the American military and political system that guarantees the security of the global order and makes the dollar the currency of stability in an uncertain world. And here's how this works, because the United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, and maintains a global network of bases and alliances. And this military power underwrites the security of international shipping lanes and trade routes, and prevents major wars between great powers. And this creates stability that makes Dollar assets attractive as safe havens because investors know that the U.S. government has the power to protect its interests and honor its commitments, and think about what this means for currency markets, because when geopolitical tensions rise or when there's a war or crisis, people move money into dollars because dollar assets are perceived as safe. And this happens regardless of whether the crisis involves the United States, because the dollar has become synonymous with stability. And during the Ukraine war, when Russia invaded in 2022, the dollar strengthened significantly because investors fled to safety. And during the Middle East conflicts, dollars strengthened. And during the trade war with China, dollars remained strong, and this safe haven function is unique to the dollar, because no other currency has the military and political backing that creates this confidence. And compare this to alternatives, because the yuan is backed by an authoritarian government that doesn't respect property rights and has a history of capital controls, and the euro is backed by a political union that's constantly threatened by internal divisions, as we saw with Brexit and the Greek debt crisis. And even gold, which some people tout as an alternative, doesn't have the liquidity or the ease of use that dollars provide. And here's the strategic element that ties everything together, because American military power is what enforces the petrodollar system and protects shipping lanes that allow dollar-based trade, and provides security guarantees to countries that hold dollar reserves. And this creates a mutual dependence where countries hold dollars, partly because they're aligned with American security guarantees, and they maintain that alignment partly because they hold so many dollars, and the numbers reveal the scale, because U.S. military spending is over $800 billion annually, and this spending is financed partly by selling treasury bonds to foreign governments, who buy those bonds because they need dollar reserves. And those dollar reserves are valuable, partly because American military power maintains global stability. And this circular relationship is self-reinforcing and incredibly difficult to break, because challenging the dollar would mean challenging American global power, and very few countries have the capacity or the willingness to do that. And even China, which has the economic size to potentially create an alternative currency system, also depends on American protected trade routes for its exports, and holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. And here's why all 5 of these reasons together create currency dominance that's essentially permanent. Because the petrodollar system creates artificial demand that forces countries to hold dollars, regardless of economic fundamentals, and deep liquid financial markets provide a place to invest those dollars that no other currency can match. And network effects mean that dollar usage reinforces itself through coordination that can't be easily undone, and dollar-denominated debt creates obligations that last for decades and lock countries into the dollar system. And American military power provides the security guarantee that makes dollars the ultimate safe haven. And these 5 mechanisms work together in ways that compound over time, because each mechanism reinforces the others, and the system becomes more entrenched with each passing year. And even if you could somehow address one of these factors, the other 4 would keep dollar dominance intact. And this explains why, despite decades of predictions about the dollar's demise, it remains as dominant today as it was 50 years ago, and actually more dominant in some measures, because the percentage of global reserves held in dollars has remained stable, while alternatives like the euro have failed to gain significant ground, and emerging market currencies remain too small and too volatile to serve as reserves. And cryptocurrencies have proven to be speculative assets rather than functional currencies. And the Chinese yuan, despite aggressive promotion by Beijing, accounts for only about 3% of global reserve holdings, because China won't open its capital account and won't subject itself to the discipline that reserve currency status requires. And here's the ultimate reality, because replacing the dollar would require a coordinated global effort to simultaneously restructure oil markets and build alternative financial markets of equivalent depth, and overcome massive network effects and refinance trillions in existing debt and create an alternative security architecture. And no country or group of countries has the capability or the incentive to do all of that. And even if they did, the United States would resist, because dollar dominance provides enormous benefits, from cheap borrowing to geopolitical leverage to the ability to impose sanctions. And America has shown repeatedly that it will use its power to maintain the dollar system. And this is why the American dollar doesn't just compete with other currencies, it destroys them by making them irrelevant for most international purposes. And this dominance is locked in through structural mechanisms that took 70 years to build and cannot be undone quickly or easily. And understanding these 5 reasons shows that dollar dominance isn't fragile or temporary. It's the foundation of the entire global financial system, and that system is designed to perpetuate dollar dominance indefinitely.